Welcome to episode 255, Ethical Kink-Affirming Practice, Power, Culture, Consent, and Pleasure, featuring Dr. Elyssa Helfer, licensed marriage and family therapist and certified sex therapist. Make sure to subscribe to be alerted about future episodes. By Clearly Clinical. Learn, grow, shine. Hello to our listeners. My name is Beth Irias, and I'm so excited to have my dear colleague, Dr. Elyssa Helfer, back with us today. She is a certified sex therapist and clinical sexologist in Southern California, and she's here to talk with us today about some of the gaps in clinical education around sexuality, specifically conversations about things like kink and BDSM, because we really don't talk about it very much clinically, and there's quite a number of clients that are interested in that and engaging in it. So there's an education gap here. Thank you so much for joining us today, Elyssa.
Thank you so much for having me back. It's a pleasure to be here.
So for our listeners that have not heard the prior episode that you had done with us, why don't you take a moment to introduce yourself and tell us about your background and how this came to be a topic that's so important to you?
Absolutely. So I am living in Los Angeles, and fortunately, this is a really good place to work with kink. There's sort of an abundance of it, and there's also an abundance of opportunity for knowledge, but that is not always the case. And so my educational journey really started before I even got my master's degree. I sort of discovered what kink was in college. I didn't really know what it was prior to that, and the resources were really limited. I was living in the Midwest at the time, and I knew very quickly that this was the career I wanted. I wanted to study this population. And unfortunately, during my formal education, that is not where it happened. So that sort of put me on this journey of wanting to change the educational systems so that we as therapists can be more competent working with this population.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you for diving in and having these conversations. Before you and I had started recording, we talked about some of the stereotypes and reactions to this topic whenever we, as Clearly Clinical, discuss things like kink. Certainly there's more conversation among clinicians. Coming out of the gate, why don't we have you describe what is kink and what is not kink, and let's start there, and then we'll dive into really looking more at erotically marginalized communities and what we as clinicians can be doing to support them.
Absolutely. So first things first, everything about kink, when kink is being done properly, is consensual. It is between consenting adults. So kink is, at least to me, expression. Kink is an art. It's a way of relating. It's a way of connecting. And even though technically by definition, it's like any interest that sort of falls out of the conventional norm, but the conventional norm, I say that in quotations, is changing. It is shifting. And so kink is something that really is just a way of connecting with other people. It is not inherently sexual, but obviously can have some of those aspects. But I just want to always emphasize every time I talk about kink and BDSM, this is always happening between consenting adults.
Thank you. I appreciate it. BDSM, can you explain that acronym for people who are not familiar with it?
Yes. So BDSM is under the umbrella of kink. So if we look at kink like an umbrella, it has a bunch of different facets. BDSM really has to do with a lot of power exchange, bondage, discipline, dominance, submission, sadism, masochism. So within BDSM, I think this is why it gets a little complicated. That in and of itself is another umbrella with a bunch of different terms that fall within there. But BDSM overall has a little bit more to do with an exchange of power, exchange of energy, maybe a giver, a receiver, rather than other areas like maybe fetishists, right? Where it's maybe not necessarily about power in any sort of a way, but more about like an erotic interest in something.
Thank you. This question may be kind of a complicated one to answer because we don't know what we don't know. Of the American adult population, about how many people are interested and or actively engaging in kink?
So you're right. It is a complicated question, especially because I think that what the research will tell us is going to look very different than what is actually happening. And this is because there's a lot of barriers to research. A lot of people who are kinky, first of all, don't realize that what they're doing is considered kinky. So that's one big part of it. We also have like, how are we defining kink? Different researchers may be defining kink differently. So the research tells us up to 25% of the population engaging, but from what I've heard amongst my colleagues, it's starting to seem like more of the population either has some fantasies or has some desire than not, which is why this topic is so incredibly important, because whether or not we're planning on it, there's a really good chance therapists will come across kinky clients.
You had said just a moment ago, people not realizing that what they're doing is kinky. Can you give some examples of that?
Sure. So some of this has to do with what is happening sexually, right? Role playing, for example, playing into a fantasy where maybe you're one role, someone something else, that is considered kinky. Maybe sex that is what some would call like rough sex or a little bit more aggressive, that could be considered kinky. Like hair pulling, things like that, involving certain types of toys, involving other people. Like there's all these ways that we could probably describe something as kinky, but it's so taboo that I think for folks who have this sort of negative stereotype around kink, they're going to like kind of push away from that idea that what they're doing or what they're desiring is kinky.
If kink is so common, it loses its kinkiness. As someone who's worked particularly with clients who are interested in and are engaging in kinky behavior, what are the limits or interests? Like, where is the line where you're like, oh, like, we were just talking about vanilla sex and now it became kinky. Like, where is that line for you? Because I imagine there's also some psycho ed that you're doing where it's like, oh, like that's part of kink. That's what we call this. Like, where is that line for you?
Yeah, I mean, I do a ton of psycho ed. That's actually really common, especially because I see a lot of folks who are sort of new to developing their kink identities. The line is going to be different for everyone. Because if someone doesn't feel like they identify as kinky, whether or not they're doing something that sort of falls into that umbrella, it's not really my role to be like, no, actually, you are this thing.
Yeah,
right?
Let me tell you what you are.
Exactly. Like, that's not going to happen. And so what I'll typically do if someone is bringing up, this usually happens when I'm hearing power-related language, because that really is mostly what I work with. I will mention it. I'll say, it sounds kind of familiar. Have you ever, learned anything about what a DS relationship looks like? Is that something you've ever considered? So I'll just kind of lean into the conversation and let them decide if they want to learn more, if they're interested in that. And if they shut it down, by all means, like, this is their work. I'm not going to push it. When I say DS, I'm saying like dominant submissive. So I'm DS, even though technically, yes, that's like the language for those letters, it could apply to a variety of power structured, like hierarchical relationships. But yeah, standard DS really is dominant submissive.
Thank you. One of the associations with kink is trauma.
Mm-hmm.
Can you speak to that a little bit? Knowing that this is just a really kind of small facet of what we're talking about, particularly today, but for listeners who have that association, can you expand on it? Because it is so common in our culture.
It is really common, and it is one of the things that comes up the most when I talk about kink. Even to my students, like, this question will come up. And first and foremost, I do want to note that the research suggests that kinky folks experience trauma to the same extent that vanilla folks do. The numbers are not higher. It is not like kinky people are, have inherently experienced trauma. I think that some of the conversation comes up because we're now in this stage of research development around kinky people who are utilizing kink as a means to sort of re-script or work through or process some of their trauma. And that can be really hard for folks to digest. And I understand that if you are not really well versed in what kink is, that is going to sound like absurd. It is, which is why I always emphasize like, we have to have this education, because if not, we're going to make assumptions that will turn kinky people away. It'll turn them off to therapy. They'll never come back. Or they'll be like the clients I have who've seen 5, 6 therapists prior to me who have all shut them down because of this part of their identity.
Given that our culture as a whole is generally not particularly sex positive, and the difficulty knowing who's engaging in kink, then that creates a new difficulty to understand how clinicians are talking with clients about kink. What does research tell us about clinician competence in discussing sexuality as a whole, but particularly kink?
So this was my dissertation topic, and one that is extremely important to me. What I found when I was doing the research for my dissertation and then doing my actual research was that first, clinicians actually had a little better attitudes than I expected, which I think was really wonderful. The issue really came up around the competence. So just to put some numbers out there, of the around 300 clinicians that were surveyed, about half of them have worked or were working with kinky clients, but only 10% had actually had any training on kink, which is a huge, huge gap. What that's telling us is there are people working with these populations who have not had any training.
Out of curiosity, did you find during that research that there was a mismatch between clinicians working with it and perceived self-competence? So what I mean by that is people working with it and being like, no, it's fine, but really they have very little exposure or education to actually do so.
Okay. So I actually wanted to study that. And I did sort of like an experimental part of my dissertation that didn't quite land, because I wanted to know, like, does someone think that they're competent, but actually are not? And it's really hard to study that, particularly because we haven't, I don't, maybe it exists now, but when I was doing the research, there isn't really a scale that has been developed to truly address what it means fully to be kink competent. What I based my questions off of were research topics that came up through like qualitative research, through like conversations, interviews, where kinky people were talking about what they liked in therapists and what they didn't like. And so I was like, okay, like that could be a really good measure, because if a kinky person is saying, oh, I like this, I like this, I like this, but a clinician is saying, I don't do that, I don't do that, I don't do that, then that's when their own perceived competence may not actually be accurate. But that, as I know, is not formally studied yet.
What were some of the other things that you found from looking at the research? Like you said, you had many more clinicians that had kinky clients than you'd expected. What else popped out at you?
Really, sort of the most glaring thing that popped out at me during that research, and sort of some of the work I've done since then, is just the lack of educational, like formal coursework within our master's degree programs. When I was looking at how do schools actually choose what they teach? Like, where's the system? Who starts that? Where's like the top of the ladder? Because I was like, I got to find it because I got to get in there. What I found was a lot of this comes down to the accrediting bodies, right? The accrediting bodies who are saying this kind of topic needs to be covered, this needs to be covered. And then the schools do, they sort of interpret that and they create their curriculum. There is nothing explicit around sex. There's nothing explicit. Now, there are things like multicultural diversity, like biopsychosocial health. And within those, yes, human sexuality can be a part of that. So some schools include it, but it is severely lacking. Like, it's just severely lacking. There's a lot of clinicians that you'll reach out to and talk to and ask, like, what did your human sexuality coursework look like? And many will say, I didn't have it. It didn't exist.
For you as a clinician who's been very much in this world, looking at this topic, the clients, the clinicians, when we clinically miss the mark, either because we are unintentionally ignorant or because we are potentially, I guess, willfully misinformed, like from like a cultural standpoint, what's at risk here with clients?
There's quite a few. I think that we have sort of the more like clear ones: elevated depression rates, elevated anxiety, um, substance use disorders, things like that. But then there's some of these other ones that are a little more nuanced, like fear of disclosure. Right? This is a topic that's been pretty heavily researched, and that a lot of kinky folks will not disclose, I mean, even injuries to healthcare professionals. So somebody can be hurt, and because of their kink identity, because they're afraid of maybe, fear of being discriminated against, they may not even be getting the services they need. So that, if as clinicians, our clients are coming in, they're bringing up something around kink, and we're approaching that from a place of judgment, we could be doing harm beyond a mental health harm. We could be contributing to potential future physical harm, sort of inadvertently, which is it's really problematic and dangerous and scary.
Can you expand on that? As you've said, and as I know to be true, people may be engaging in these behaviors or just curious about them and then not knowing where to get information. And so it's like, well, I asked somebody and this is what I think we do. And as I say that, I'm like, oh, it sounds like how many of us learned about sexuality in general, where like we're getting just a lot of misinformation or lack of information. Can you expand on where kink can go wrong and what you've seen? Because really, I think what we're talking about is looking at all aspects of wellness and health, and including sexuality as part of that, and then the folks who are interested in kink. When it's done wrong, dangerously, can you expand on that?
Yeah, I mean, like any other thing we do, things can be done wrong, right? Driving can be done wrong. People can get in an accident. So we have to consider that within any form of expression, particularly those where there's some physicality involved, things can go wrong. There can be an accident. Someone can get hurt. There's sort of like the accidental wrongs. And then there's the wrongs that come from a true lack of knowledge. And this is where I see that like question around how do you differentiate between seeing an abusive relationship and seeing a kink relationship that involves power exchange. That's where that question, to me at least, comes up, in that people can argue that kink gone wrong looks like abuse or is abuse, but it's sort of like, if there is no consent, if the consent frameworks are not being adhered to, I don't call that kink. That is not kink to me, right? Kink, there are pillars that hold up kink, and consent, negotiation, agreements, conversations, honesty, safety. Like, these things are vital for kink to exist, for kink to be done well. Is kink inherently safe? No, nothing exists that's inherently safe. There's risks everywhere. But within a really healthy kink dynamic, those risks are talked about, they're discussed, they're agreed upon, they're acknowledged. So within that scenario or in that context, that is kink to me. When somebody is coercing someone else, when they're, saying, oh, this is what kink is, but it's really not. And I've seen that come up where someone is sort of thinking that they know what they're doing, but they maybe aren't. And that's where some of this harm comes in, which is, again, why psychoeducation ends up being, a really heavy part of my work with my clients, so that they can understand, like, is this really what kink is? And let's talk about how these things show up within the kink community. Does that match what your experience is?
I'm glad we're talking about this. It's been my experience, having worked with kinky clients and also having been part of communities where there are things like kink displays where it's like, oh, you know, we're going to show how some of these things work. And like, here's this particular device, or here's this, this concept in practice. One of the core parts that I have seen should always be about consent. And I think you brought up such a good point where it's like, when there's not consent, then it's not kink.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
And I have never really thought about it that way, but that certainly has struck me at times where I'm like, well, wait a minute, like talking to someone going, and then what happened? And then they took pictures. Did you say they could take pictures? Mm-hmm. Like, how do you feel about that? And therein lies, I could see those holes in our clinical knowledge if we're not thinking about consent as the framework, and then also that really interesting role that clinicians play sometimes where, well, a really good example, I think, is when a client, comes in for the first time and you're talking about their childhood and they're like, oh, my childhood was normal. And you're like, tell me about normal. Tell me what that means. And it's like we come to realize that like whatever we think is normative is just really within our own little bubble. Right. And then the potential for a clinician to be in the position of going, so what you just described, and then you're like, do I use the word? Like whatever the word is, like whether it's abuse, whether it's assault, like whatever that is, where you're like, going back to what you had said about lack of clinical knowledge and comfort, I could see a major missed opportunity there if a clinician doesn't have enough familiarity with kink to understand the pillars and framework. Then we're not potentially going that extra step to psychoeducate because we're like, oh, okay, I guess that's what it means for you. But it's like, no, but actually what just happened wasn't kinky. That was abusive.
Right. Exactly. That's why this is so important. And not only because, we may miss, right? Let's say that there's a therapist that has no education around kink. They're working with a client starts to talk about their kink experiences that are abusive, right? If a clinician cannot notice that's what that is, if the client is saying, no, this is normal, that's kinky. My partner says that this is what we do in the kink community, and then the therapist doesn't have this knowledge, maybe they're going along with it, right? There's that part, which is risky. The other part is a client comes in, they're talking about their really beautiful, healthy kink dynamic, but the therapist interprets that as abusive. That's where that also can be a problem. So one of the main things I talk about with my students is like, okay, right, what I'll do is I'll show them this like wheel of abuse. I'll put like this wheel up and I'll say, okay, within each of these little sections, how can this also look like kink? So an example of that could be utilization of certain language. There are certain language that can be absolutely categorized as verbal abuse toward a partner. That exact language with consent, maybe in a sexual scenario, within a power dynamic, can be utilized. And it's perfectly healthy. It's perfectly fine. It's comfortable. It's what's wanted. It's what's consented to and agreed upon. So we're looking now at two identical phrases. Not only I'll say phrases in class that I will not say here, but we're looking at two identical phrases where one is healthy and one is abusive. It's part of our work to be able to differentiate between those and have that knowledge so that we can go, the difference between going, hey, really glad you had a fun weekend, that sounds wonderful, versus let's talk a little bit more about that. What came up when those words were said to you? And all of a sudden now we're shifting into a different type of work rather than just validating a really cool experience that they had where all of that language was something that they wanted to hear.
There's another hotspot that I think you just kind of walked right into, so I'm going to go after it. One of the more interesting aspects of my work with kinky clients is exploring the reaction after consent has been given. So it's like, okay, so like you you went to this party. This is what you were hoping to partake in. And you said yes. And then you did this thing. And now how are you feeling? One of the things that I've found, and I would love to hear more from you as someone who's really specialized in this, is sometimes just like the complexity of the feelings that come up where it's like, I really thought that this was okay or that this was what I wanted. And I feel like I, did the work, if you will, before saying yes, like, please do that, or I'd like to do that to you, or do that to me, or I'd like to watch, or whatever it is. And then it's like, nope, after the fact, where it's like, I'm not sleeping well, and I had a panic attack after it happened. Can you speak to that part of it too? Because I imagine that's another real clinical hole here. Because like one thing I've certainly told clients is like, and this is true, humans are really bad at predicting our future behavior and like how we're going to respond to something. So it's like we give each other this, the interview question of like, where do you see yourself in 5 years? We're terrible at that. We are terrible at answering that question. Or the whole, like, you're standing in a bank and someone walks in to rob it. What are you going to do? Right. Like, we're terrible at answering those kind of questions. And so there's also, like, this possibility that we can consent to something, that our clients can consent to something, and then be like, ruh-roh.
Yes, absolutely. This is why sometimes when I talk about what goes into a negotiation before a scene, and I'm like, okay, well, sometimes we need to talk about a trigger plan. What happens if a trigger gets activated? Sometimes clients don't know what their trigger is. They don't know yet. It hasn't happened. And so I think actually this particular facet is a clinical skill that everyone should have, period, regardless if it's around kink, which is what happens when our clients engage in anything that they think is going to go a certain way and it goes another way, right? When they engage in anything that they didn't realize that, going to the concert was going to have them feel so overwhelmed, claustrophobic, surrounded by people, and then they have a panic attack, right? How do we then manage that? And I think when that sort of stuff comes up, it gives us an opportunity to understand, for our clients to understand themselves better, for us to do more of that work, understanding maybe where that trigger came from, what to do if it ever comes up again. The feelings that come up after kink experiences can be very complicated, especially because within the context of kink, especially in scenes that are sort of like high intensity, kinky people will move into a different state of consciousness. And that's complicated because sometimes people don't know that that's going to happen. They don't know how to handle the come down from that. They maybe haven't had a conversation around what aftercare would look like. They maybe don't debrief properly. Like there's so many aspects, which again, and I'm probably going to get annoying saying this over and over, but again, this speaks to why we have to have at least, at minimum, a basic knowledge of what does the process of formatting a kink scene look like? What needs to exist? What are those steps that have to happen? What are sort of the most common popular consent frameworks that kinky people typically abide by? What are those? What does that look like? And then, of course, recognizing that with any new exploration, things are going to come up, which is why the importance of how are you choosing who you're playing with? How are you choosing what type of play do you do? Are our clients moving too quickly? I mean, the reality is sometimes when a person discovers this part of themselves, they kind of they get hyped up. They go into maybe like a little bit of a frenzy. They get really excited. They try a lot of things. And sometimes when that happens, stuff can go wrong. And it's an opportunity for us to work with them, to process it, to work through it so that we can help them understand, well, what does a yes truly mean? What does pleasure truly mean? What truly excites them? And just getting them to kind of sit in that truth when they're going to go continue on in their kink journey.
Because it's fresh in my mind and a recent example. So as we're recording this, we're in May of 2025. The recently released TV miniseries featuring Michelle Williams, Dying for Sex. We see many examples about kink and also some confrontation, a little bit of like what it's not, where it's like, well, if you're going to like want to dominate, then you need to experience submission, and you need to think about how these ideas work. And this introduction that Michelle Williams' character has into kind of the kink universe and the people who are teaching her and the things that she doesn't know, I think, you know, and it scratches the surface. But I think we're starting to see more in the media of like these examples, other, you know, outside of just porn.
Yes.
And yes, so our listeners are not watching your face right now. Can you explain the face that you just made when I saw that? Because I saw that face and they didn't.
The porn, the inaccurate media depictions. I mean, that is just, it's so unbelievably toxic. Gotta remember something about porn. Porn shows a snippet of an experience. We could never, I mean, with the exception of like truly, and I do believe that there are some ethical porn where the negotiation is actually, it's filmed, it's talked about, consent is talked about, right? Aside from that, I beg of all listeners, please do not look at porn as an example for what kink is or is not. You will never find the answer there. You will also likely not find the answer in media depictions. This particular show you're talking about, I have not seen it, although I have heard amongst some of my like kink specializing colleagues that they're pretty happy with it, which is really, really cool because that is extremely, extremely rare. And I wonder, like, if it's because they are being advised by people who are a part of the community.
After having watched it, I'm like, they had to have had people not only who were part of the community, but also mental health professionals that were having conversations to say, like, well, here's some of the considerations. Because that was particularly to see it in a mini series, the way that it was depicted. And, you know, it's against the backdrop of a terminal diagnosis. Like, it's a very serious topic. But this exploration of a woman diving into her sexuality and her experience in the world, even just that is a space that has not much been explored in our media in the United States. But then to take it kind of the step further where it's like, okay, what about looking at the non-vanilla world and my curiosity and what this is like for, you know, my identity is really what it is for her, where it's like, who am I and what about this part of myself that I've never gotten to explore?
Sounds awesome. One day I'll check it out.
Yes, one day you will check it out. That was actually going to kind of be the next question, and it leads in beautifully. When there are so few examples of healthy, true consensual kink, therein lies the problem. If we're not talking about it in master's and doctoral programs, if as a society we're really not talking about it, unless you are actively pursuing exposure to it as a human being. Mm-hmm. So you're going to events where they have a kink display and they have, you know, products that you can ask about or products that someone could try and show you or you could experience. Where are clinicians getting this information to work with kinky clients?
Fortunately, right now, there are more and more opportunities to learn about kink from people who are experts in the field. Right now, at this point, because I remember when I first started really studying this topic, it was a little bit hard. I was having a hard time finding sort of things beyond Kink 101. That is not the case anymore. It is out there. Organizations like Tashra, like the Science of BDSM Lab, even some of these like bigger, what's it called? Like organizations like Modern Sex Therapy Institutes or Learn Sex Therapy. Even these different organizations have content around kink. So at this point, if clinicians are not getting this training, it's because they're not seeking the training. Because if they wanted it, it does exist. It is out there. I mean, heck, they could listen to our past recording and learn a little bit about kink. So it's as easy as a Google search. I will say I absolutely can recognize some of the barriers to this knowledge, particularly financial barriers to taking a long or expensive class. But even searching like free CEs on kink, stuff will come up. It exists now.
I had a supervisor once in my master's program who said something to the effect of, you can only take a client as far as you've gone yourself. And I'm still kind of thinking about, like, what did that mean? And the ways that I conceptualize that I agree with that I disagree with that. When we live in a sex negative culture, it would seem to me that there is a lot of work that many of us would need to do to be aware of how we're showing up in the room, and that's separate from understanding, how many people are doing this, and explain this device and how it's used. And like, let's talk about, like, what does consent really mean? Like, there are all those little, like, cool check boxes. Like, I learned those things. I can recite them. But then there's actually so that thing, that's gross. Like, where it's like, oh, there's one of my blind spots.
Yeah.
So I'm like, yeah, people shouldn't do that. That's that, like, there's kink and then there's that. And why would anybody do that thing? How do you conceptualize that part of it? Like, therapist is human, human is therapist.
Yeah.
Sitting in the room with somebody, talking about sex, talking about kink, and we all have our own stuff.
Yes. So I love this topic. I don't know that my students do, but I love it because what you're speaking to is recognizing our own biases. What are they? Where are they? How do they play out in the therapy room? And that journey is hard. That is a tough journey. If listening to something like this, a conversation around kink, causes a feeling inside of discomfort, right? That is already pointing to, oh, maybe there's something there. Maybe there's something I need to explore. And a lot of what I'll do when I'm teaching about this topic is I personally like to push my students. So I will give case studies that are extremely difficult, that are conversations or types of kink expression that are a little bit more unique, a little bit more rare, maybe some would consider more extreme, because I want them to feel that discomfort. Right? I want them to feel it in a place that is safe to explore it, because the place to explore it is absolutely not the therapy room. It's with me in a class where we go, oof, you felt something about that, felt uncomfortable for you. Maybe you don't want to work with that. Maybe you have this bias where you think that maybe it's wrong, like morally or whatever. Like, I want people to have the opportunity to explore that aspect so that it can get done in a space that is not going to cause potentially significant harm to a client. If if a face gets shown in the therapy room of disgust, if somebody has an opinion about it that comes out, like, this is our own personal work on biases. And it's hard, I get it, but it is crucial if we really want to be a strong clinician in any regard, regardless of if it's around sexuality.
I appreciate the cultural diversity angle that you're coming at it from. Non-Black or African American clinicians working with Black and African American clientele. The idea of cultural humility,
Yes.
The awareness that we're never going to be competent in somebody else's lived experience. Doesn't matter who you are, where you are, what you've learned, how many courses you've taken. Right. You will never, ever be an expert in somebody else's lived experience. You cannot be competent. Right. That idea of white affinity, where it's like, could we be in spaces where white people can talk about our biases, about our experience,
Yep.
and unpack it. And I appreciate what you're saying, which is kind of the sex and kink equivalent, which is, don't unpack that in a therapy room with a client, because then you're potentially just re-traumatizing them and setting up a situation that may replicate other environments that they've been in.
Right.
And thinking about that, and, the importance of rapport, it's really important.
Absolutely.
To, as you said, like, not make that face.
Absolutely. This is why exploring biases, exploring our own privilege, exploring dimensions of power, all of those things must exist in conjunction to understanding what kink is, how kink exists, how people participate in it. Like, this, as you sort of said, this is not just about going, this is what BDSM stands for. I know something. That's great. Yes, of course. Like we want that foundational knowledge. But to really properly work with this community, we have to understand our biases. We have to understand how our own privilege shows up. We have to understand how power shows up because we're talking about a marginalized population that's highly stigmatized, where there are potentials for, like, the worst thing to me in therapy is being the person that makes someone never want to go to therapy again. And you hear about that, right? You hear about the clients, you read something on a forum online or talk to a friend who's like, I had a therapist and they judged me, or I felt this, I felt that. You never want to be that person. And so, really, why I stand so firmly in these beliefs that I have is because I have worked with clients who have been with that person who has said that, their relationship that they were in was abusive when it wasn't, or that their relationship or what they're into is really problematic when it's not, right? Or when people just are allowing for their own biases or lack of knowledge to make an assessment that is just inaccurate and then causes this harm where now 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the road, when beautiful work could have been done, it got halted because of that experience.
In saying that, we're starting then to get into the ethics of this and the concept of autonomy. Our culture loves little columns and put people in little columns.
Indeed.
Sort them. We're going to say right, wrong, good, bad. This is your identity. We're learning more and more in the therapy space. So when we do that, it doesn't always work out very well for clients. And I think you just kind of alluded to that, where it's like, what are we doing and how is it setting up somebody for success and getting what they came for?
Right.
Why they are spending their time with us, giving us their money, signing consent forms, abiding by our schedule, whatever it is. Or are we doing something that is actively and potentially inadvertently abusing power and making it so that they don't get what they came for? If that's, improved relationships or reduction in tearful crying episodes or whatever it is that they came in for. Can you talk a bit about the ethical side of competence, or, again, what is competence, but awareness around biases with regard to sexuality and particularly kink?
Yes, I'd be delighted to. Kink Education as an Ethical Obligation is an article that I have written because I do believe that at this point, with the amount of knowledge that exists, if we are actively making a choice not to pursue education regarding clients that we work with, we are behaving unethically. And to be fair, I would say this about any population. If I have a client who comes to me and they're dealing with issues of addiction, it's not my specialty. Like, the uproar that would exist in the community if I was just like, well, I'm just going to keep winging it. Forget it. I don't need the education. It's fine. I mean, that would it would be nonsense to do that. We're talking about a population. And if we're talking about erotically marginalized communities in general, you're going to see them. You're going to see someone. It is going to happen, which means that if your educational institution did not provide enough education, which I can pretty confidently say it probably didn't, because even if they did get into human sexuality, it was probably like diseases, disorders, discrepancies, things like that. It's our duty. Our duty is to we have to have a level of competence. If we don't have that level, we are obligated to refer a client out, right? Like that is a foundational part of our work, is that we should not be working outside of our scope of competence. I think the problem is that when we're talking about something like kink, someone might not realize that their bias is a part of a lack of competence, right? If a client shows up and they bring up any kink at all, period. If a clinician is showing up with a bias and they're being judgmental or trying to sway the client away from something that they're interested in, we're not doing our jobs anymore, right? Now we're just trying to I don't know, influence a client to believe or do or behave in the ways that we do. And that's just the last thing we're supposed to do as clinicians.
Speaking as a clinician who has worked throughout my career quite a bit with the queer community, and also having interacted with clinicians who have not worked as much deliberately with the queer community, one of the things I've heard come up is like, well, I don't need to learn about that because that thing happens over there with those people. Like if they're of a certain age, or if they have had certain life experiences, or if they have a certain gender identity. Elyssa, will you please dispel that? Do the research thing where you're like, actually, let's talk about like who is kinky. I want you to please go ahead. I'm inviting you. Do the thing where you talk about that, because I think we do this so much as clinicians, and at the end of the day, I think a lot of us probably know a little bit about a lot of things, and then we have a few things that we know a lot about. Like me and eating disorders. Like that's absolutely where I refer out. I'm really comfortable with addiction. I've spent a lot of time working with it. I have specialized education. I have the experience. But I also know with eating disorders, I'm like, nope. Like that's where I don't know what to do and I need help and I need to refer out. Can you give us more education on a little bit about kink and some of the myths about who participates in kink? Because I've totally heard clinicians say like, oh, well, I tend to only work with like middle-aged white moms.
Well, that's interesting, because what we see now, I will say again, the research does hold a little bit of bias because it is particularly very white. People who participate in kink is not in a box. There is no race, there is no gender, there is no anything that does not participate in kink. That does not exist. That idea of it is just that group over there. Kink permeates all cultures. Kink is expression. It's like saying that only musicians are this person. No, because like kink, which is art, music is art, right? These are forms of expression. There's no box. And I think that narrative of I should not learn about this because I don't think I'm going to see it. Well, I will always believe in autonomy. I believe people have a choice to determine if they don't want to have further their education. But what I will say is that if that is a person, if someone makes that decision, they should be referring out 100% of the time if kink comes up. It is just the wrong fit always. And I mean, I read this research one time. I wish that I could remember who wrote it. That was talking about how much education would you really need in kink to have some level of competence, to sort of raise the competency level. And it was like 3 hours. We're not talking about, coming to one of my like 10-hour intensives. Like we're talking about, can you read one book to start getting a basis of knowledge that can be helpful in these situations? Because the study that I did, where about half of my population had worked with kinky clients, it's not the only one that's done that, right? There's studies that have come out where we've surveyed clinicians, have you worked with kinky clients? Some of these studies are up to like 75% of them saying yes, it's going to happen. Doesn't matter what state you live in. It doesn't matter like what population you serve, especially because kink does intersect with some other identities. You see a lot of overlap between kinky clients, queer clients, like neurodivergent clients. You see kind of like some overlap that will happen. Yeah, it's just kind of false, the idea that someone is never going to work with this because they think, oh, I only work with this population. It's going to come up. Sex is always going to come up.
Thank you for dispelling that myth. And I actually want to build on what you just said, which is sex is always going to come up. For you as someone who specializes in this, sex will come up with you. Mm-hmm. And I've thought about this with clinicians before, like having interviewed someone who specializes in traumatic brain injury. And I'm going, wow, I don't think I ever asked that question on assessment. Because her specialization is different than mine. And so how she sees assessment and what she's looking for is different than my lens. My experience has been, for the most part, clients often kind of tiptoeing around sex.
Yeah.
Like that I'm setting the tone when I'm asking about whether or not they're in an intimate relationship, if that's something they're interested in, what that's been like for them. And then also like, how I'm normalizing and deliberately asking the question, like, are you sexually active? What does sex mean to you? Are you attracted to people? Tell me who you like. What do you not like? Whatever it is. But so there's a normalization, but then there's also like this whole element of safety and trust with a client. And so like, I don't think sex is always going to come up if we don't make space for it. I think it often doesn't come up at all. And maybe not necessarily having anything to do with us as a clinician. It's just because there is so much muck around human sexuality in our culture where it's like, we do not talk about that. I was raised Catholic. We do not talk about that. Yeah. And for me, in my own experience as a human being, to continue unpacking my marinade, what did I learn growing up? What were messages around my body, around other people's bodies, around consent, around gender and sexuality, like all these different ideas. And also, that's typically not something I am going to talk about intimately with someone unless they've earned it.
Yeah.
And that goes back, I think, to what you were talking about in our awareness of bias and how are we showing up in the room. And if we make that face when someone talks about like pulling out some bondage devices, then it's like, that's my edge. There's a clinical edge that I have if I'm not bringing this up and if I get weird when it comes up.
Yeah, I love the way you added on to that, right? Sex always comes up, or sex will not always come up unless the space is created for it. I think that is so spot on, especially in populations where they have maybe historically been sort of desexualized. Sometimes clinicians are not going to be comfortable having these conversations. I mean, one of the courses that one of the topics that I always try to bring in is like sex and disability, right? We're talking about populations that can be desexualized by their clinician by moving away from conversations around sex and making assumptions around sex. So like, I think it just really speaks to how we need to show up in our space as the clinician with an openness, with patience, like recognizing that I know for many of my clients, it is not easy to talk about sex. I have clients who will not tell me about their kinks until maybe we're a year into our therapy. It takes time to develop that. And I think that one of the best things that we can do to move closer in that direction is to show our own comfort, to show that if a topic comes up around sex, we're not going to be squeamish. We're not going to be weird about it. We're literally just going to be like, okay, cool. Tell me more about that, right? That we can approach it from this just sort of like casual place, and that we can really honor and appreciate when clients do bring these things in, to recognize that that really shows that we've reached this level of connection and a level of trust that we're hoping to get with all of our clients.
Your magic wand, where you can wave it and you improve clinical education, specifically relating to kink. What would that actually include?
Oof. Okay. Well, if this is my magical one, I can go to the most far extremes. Okay.
Yes, okay. Please go. I want you to go there because I have a feeling I know where you're going to go, and I want you to go there.
I would say, number one, that every single master's program must have a human sexuality course that goes beyond just like, oh, this is erectile dysfunction. Here is this thing that goes beyond that. So I would want really inclusive, diverse human sexuality coursework. Fantasyland, I would also say that there should be a requirement during that course that clinicians or future clinicians do work on their own. that they maybe go get some sex therapy so that they can start unpacking their own stuff. We all have our own stuff. This is my specialty. I have my own stuff. Like, that is okay. It is perfectly normal. It is human. So I would say, oof, a requirement to learn about it and a requirement to unpack it. If those two things existed, our community, the kink community, all erotically marginalized communities would be significantly safer in our spaces.
So I'm taking the magic wand out of your hand.
No,
Thank you, Elyssa.
Let
I'm
me
sorry.
keep it.
I know. And a clinician listening is like, yeah, that stuff makes me feel weird. And I don't know how to talk to clients about it. Where do you recommend that they start? You know, you'd mentioned continuing ed. What are other helpful resources, I guess sometimes to kind of put ourselves intentionally in uncomfortable spaces where it's like, whoa, I saw that scene and I was like, no, I can't look right at it. What are those resources for you to really like kind of bring some of the stuff up where it's like, oh, that's where I need to work. That's my clinical edge.
Well, okay. It should be done slowly because I really, really want to acknowledge, I know that this conversation is hard. I know that. Like, we're in a sex negative culture, which means that by even having this conversation, we are going against what we are taught, what we are told we should be doing. So that's already going to cause tension and discomfort. I would say that in the beginning, probably approaching media that is like online, reading books, reading articles, ensuring that the sources are, we're looking at researchers, we're looking at people, educators, people who have credibility to have these conversations. I do think that starting there is a really good place. I know that there's an assignment that I give my class in, it is in Stephanie Gorelick's, my co-author, but in her book, The Leather Couch. Oh, I might say it wrong, but I think it's like the self-ick assessment. And in her book, there's an assessment that you can do where you are going through all these different kinks and being like, oof, that makes me feel weird, or oh, but I'm okay talking about that. Now, I do think it's helpful to have a space to process what comes up there. So maybe that's something that takes a little bit of time, but I think that like reading, those kinds of things are a little bit less threatening than showing up to a course. So I'd say starting there, starting with doing some reading, moving into maybe doing some like asynchronous coursework where you're just kind of sitting and watching from your own space where you can be comfortable. And then when we start to get to a place of like, if you want to move from being kink aware, kink friendly into kink competent or being a kink expert, now we have to move beyond there and go to clinical consultation and doing a SAR, like the sexual attitude reassessment. Doing SARs can be, it's funny, if you were already a kink expert, doing a SAR is going to feel like a normal day at work. If you are not, the sort of purpose of that is to stretch your comfort, to move you out and make, you kind of watch videos or have conversations about things that are supposed to elicit that discomfort. And then you kind of process it in a space. So I would say that like getting to that point would be fantastic. Not everyone's going to be up for it, which is perfectly fine. But I think that if kinky clients are something you actually do want to work with, it should be really necessary in your education. But just to at least read some books, a bunch of us have published at this point, so the resources do exist. I think that'd be a really good place and hopefully a safe place to start.
What are your favorite resources? Like, you've mentioned some acronyms as we've been talking of different organizations. Like, who are your go-tos of like, this is a resource that you can generally trust?
So my number one go-to, and I'll admit that I am affiliated with them, so I am a bit biased, is TASHRA, the Alternative Sexualities Health Research Alliance. TASHRA's work is 100% dedicated to understanding the kink community, doing research on the kink community in order to help serve that population. And TASHRA puts out coursework monthly-ish, right? Puts out research, puts out coursework. I think the NCSF, the National Coalition for Sexual Freedom, this is more of like an advocacy activist organization but they'll provide consent workshops. I mean, NCSF is a fantastic organization as well. I would say that Science of BDSM Lab is another place to look at research that is coming out. And then there's just like a bunch of individuals who put out good resources, like Stephanie Gorelick, great resources. The Leather Couch is awesome. Kink-Affirming Clinician, great. These are great books that she has put out. And she also put out a book that is more for like mainstream population instead of like a clinical population, called Sprinkles, which is about working with or people who are in a relationship where one is kinky and one is not, and kind of working through that. I would say the book that Stephanie and I wrote, BDSM and Kink, the Basics, sets a pretty good foundational knowledge of what kink is.
I think you gave us some really good places to start, and I appreciate that. There's obviously so much more to be said on this topic, and I think during this conversation, we've touched on a lot of different specifics and themes. Elyssa, it's always so wonderful to have you and hear from you. Thank you for coming on. For our listeners that want to learn more specifically about you and your work, what's the best way to do that?
So the best way to do that is to go to my website at centerforrelationaltherapy.com. Feel free to reach out to me. I love to provide trainings. I love to provide education. I'll come into supervision if there's ever a kinky client and no one knows what to do with that. I'm happy to be contacted and to be connected. This is so important to me. It's a delight to be here and to have this conversation. I'm so grateful. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for coming. Again, for our listeners, we've had the pleasure today hearing from Dr. Elyssa Helfer. She, again, is a clinical sexologist. Thank you so much for joining us. It was wonderful to have you.
You've just finished listening to another exclusive continuing ed podcast by Clearly Clinical. If you like what you just heard and you need continuing ed credits, please visit us at clearlyclinical.com to check out our 1-year membership, where you'll have access to our growing library of continuing ed podcast courses. Clearly Clinical, where our goal is to help you learn, grow, and shine.